Hello, and welcome to our tutorial today on compiling Houdini Engine plugin and Unreal in Linux. Who am I? My name is Dan Schneider. Many of you may know me as Eyevex, E-Y-E-V-E-X. I'm the blue mouse with the paintbrush you can see on the corner of some of these slides. On various Houdini forums, Epic, GitHub, OddForce. I've been working in visual effects and animation for 20 years in all kinds of roles, pipeline supervision, crowd technologies, and I've been an avid Linux user at home and at work since about 2003. What are we doing here? Installing Houdini in Linux, compiling Unreal Engine 4 from source code for OpenGL and Vulkan. Now, typically, you would at this point want to move to Vulkan as it's been default for some time. But you may have a variety of reasons to not do that. And licensing the Houdini engine, you'll need a commercial Houdini or Houdini engine license to launch Houdini engine in Unreal. An option is if you use the free Houdini Indie license available from Side Effects. And I'll show you how to do that if appropriate, but please make sure you are eligible for that license. We're going to edit a tiny bit of Houdini Engine plugin for Unreal 4 source to make it work with the current production build of Houdini. I will be compiling the Houdini Engine plugin for Unreal in Linux and testing that it all works. We're going to want to confirm Unreal Engine went smoothly, as well as the compilation of the plugin, and see it all working together by eventually loading a Houdini Digital Asset inside of the Unreal editor. Why make this video at all? Well, for a couple of reasons. Linux, although widely used in VFX and anim, is at a disadvantage when it comes to pre-built binaries. Windows, it's very easy to get a pre-built binary of the engine, as well as of the Houdini engine for Unreal plugin. In Linux, that's not the case. They're not particularly available. Fortunately, both Side Effects and Epic are good enough to give us everything we need to get up and running, and it's fairly simple and straightforward. Development instructions, though, were written in different places, some by Epic, some by Houdini, and this kind of ties everything together into a single place, so we can talk about the common pitfalls. And before you start, you should probably be familiar with a few things. The Linux command line and desktop. I'm assuming if you are watching this, you have at least some familiarity with the Linux desktop. We'll be using KDE on Ubuntu 18.04 LTS. And you should have some familiarity with the Linux command line as well, either bash or tcsh. By no means is expert knowledge needed to do this, but you need to do enough to navigate the file system, do basic Linux commands, launch applications. You should have some familiarity with Houdini Digital Assets and OTLs, what these little modules in Houdini are, and the application you offer them in. There's a lot of great resources at sideeffects.com, as well as OddForce, which is the largest Houdini community site. Linux packages. We're going to talk a little bit about Linux packages, not a lot, just a basic knowledge. If you understand what they are, will help when we come and talk about Vulkan and OGL, and have a general idea what compiling is. Hopefully this isn't the first time you're hearing the word compile. If it is, take a few minutes, do some searching on Google, and get a basic idea about how this works. We won't be writing make files or doing much low-level work, and we can do most of what we need by executing commands in the shell. There's going to be a few sign-ins you need to do, and we'll talk about that more in a second. What you will need. I recommend 125 gigabytes for Unreal 4 and Houdini 7. Now, ignore what the Epic documents recommend for a second. The last time I compiled on Cent 7, it was approximately 128 gigs with the source and the compiled code. Houdini itself is a significant download, and we will need space to download that, unarchive it, and install it. It might be wise to set up a separate partition in an area or an area with a storage quota if you're tight with space. You obviously need the Linux desktop. This has been tested in KDE under Ubuntu LTS 18 and Cent 7. The outside dependencies to the source directory are very, very minimal. I would expect it all to work with Red Hat Enterprise 7, obviously, as well as Linux Mint being downstream of Ubuntu. All tests were in KDE desktop. I did attempt to test on Cent 7 under default GNOME, and it worked reasonably well. I hadn't really investigated further because I just wanted to try it on GNOME quickly. You're going to need internet access. You're going to need this to download, get SVN repos, zip files if you choose to do that route, Unreal dependencies, install the Houdini Engine licenses, retrieve license entitlements, This can also be done without internet access and download a separate machine, but it's really beyond the scope of this tutorial. You need rights to install, sudo rights. This makes pretty good sense. We're going to install stuff. You need to be a quote-unquote super user. You're going to need a GPU. I've done all my tests only with NVIDIA, GeForce and Quadro. And with that said, it doesn't have to be a very modern GPU. In this demo, I'm just using an older mobile GTX 960. So you don't have to run out and buy the greatest graphics card ever just to do this. Though if you start doing heavy work in Unreal, you may want to. You're going to need a recent NVIDIA driver. You don't have to get the most current bleeding edge driver by any means. But you should update to the best one available if you can. Having an extremely old driver could potentially cause some issues when you're building. You're also going to need a valid Houdini Engine license and a valid commercial asset. If you have a commercial node locked or floating license, you likely already have that. For minimal commercial and non-commercial use, side effects is great, and they provide a free license to run the Houdini Engine Indie. We will briefly go over how to do this as well. It is also important that we need to have the asset to load to test with, also called an HA or OTL. Now, these can't be created in the free non-commercial version of Houdini. However, they can be in the professional version. I am using one from the Orbolt store, which is the side effects smart asset store that has an appropriate license. Now, we talked about you're going to have to sign up for some accounts. These are some of the ones you're going to need. Most of the code is hosted on GitHub as far as the Houdini Engine plugin from RHEL, as well as Unreal itself. So you will need a GitHub account. You also will need an account on sideeffects.com, the makers Houdini, as well as www.epicgames.com if you don't have an account there. So you'll need all three of those just to get the code and the downloads. They should all be free to set up. You'll need to follow the instructions also shown, which will show you how do you link your Unreal and Engine account with my GitHub account. Now you could just type in this address here or search from Google. It's pretty easy to find this link, or just if you feel free, pause the video and just follow the instructions by looking at it there. Can't remember if there's a bit of turnaround time involved, so it is possible that you may need to pause this and take a break. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully by now you have your account set up at sideeffects.com, at Epic Games, as well as GitHub, and have your Epic Games account linked to your GitHub account. And now we're going to go to GitHub and we're going to grab the Unreal source code. So here's GitHub. I've already logged in. And if we click this green button here, you can see we have a couple of options to get the code. Now, for the purpose of this tutorial, I'll be using Git. For the Git option, you need to have Git installed in Linux already, or you'll need to install it. If you're not comfortable with doing that for the sake of this exercise, another option is SVN, if you are comfortable with that or have that installed, or to simply download the zip archive, as you can see is an option down here, and then you can extract it in place in your file system. And you could do it that way if nothing else is of comfort. However, in the long run, if you are planning on working with the source code, I strongly recommend going to Git. It'll allow you very quickly to get updates and synchronize your code, as well as all the nice conveniences that come with the content versioning system if you want to continue using the source, and there are many resources online. We're going to grab this address here. We can hit this and I'll copy it to the clipboard. And then we're going to go to our shell. And we're going to want to git clone the address. Now, I have a setup here, a partition to work in. There's nothing else here right now. For the sake of convenience and monitoring flooding it. So we do that. And it's going to ask you for your username as well as your password, which is the ones from GitHub. Now, depending on the size of your internet connection, you may want to take a break for this. Maybe go get a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom. Download will be around 80 gigabytes, which is pretty significant. So during a lot of these, we're going to do a time lapse, and so we'll see you as soon as this is done. Hi, and welcome back. Hopefully you had a good coffee break. You should have seen something along the lines of counting objects 100% done, and then a bunch of percentage numbers going up, receiving objects, receiving deltas 100% done, checking out files 100% done, which means you got everything. If not, you may need to rerun your commands. And the next thing we'll be looking at is Vulkan versus OGL4 as far as build options. Now, this machine does not have all the tools necessarily installed to build against Vulkan, and Vulkan has been the default target for the past few releases. Vulkan is a new API like OGL4, and it allows lower level controllability by the software developers. So using Vulkan compared to OpenGL will actually give you supposedly up to a 30% increase. But you may not always be in an environment where you're able to do that. Or maybe it's just for the purpose of the tutorial, you're not ready to move to Vulkan. But in the long run, if you're going to continue an Unreal Engine, again, I strongly recommend going with Vulkan. So the first thing we want to do is say, are we using Vulkan, or do we have, more accurately, the packages installed we need already? So I'm using apt because I am on Ubuntu. You'll need alternative commands for yum if you're using a Red Hat based distro. So what we can do is say apt list installed and then Vulkan. And what we can see is we have the Mesa Vulkan drivers and live Vulkan, but we don't have Vulkan tools. And again, we can confirm that by typing apt list -a Vulkan tools. And if that was installed, we'd see next to it in brackets here, it would say installed, and it does not. There's also alternate commands for dpkg, which we're not going to get into. And if you're on Red Hat, it'll look something more like yum list installed. And then you'll have to sort through with grep -i Vulkan. The package names are also different on Red Hat based distros like Cent. So instead of seeing Vulkan-tools, what you'll see is a package. It's either called just Vulkan or Vulkan API, which is the API, and as a dependency will install Vulkan file system. And you can check if you're on one of those distros by not checking for installed and just listing them, and you should see one either called Vulkan or Vulkan API. I'm fairly certain it's just Vulkan. Okay, so we know now we can't do this against Vulkan without installing things. This particular instance. So we have a couple options, right? The first one would be use Vulkan if it was installed already. Obviously, we don't have the API installed, but we're going to. The other option is for a variety of reasons. Like I said, if you can't, for whatever reasons, move to Vulkan, or you're not ready to move to Vulkan, you can re-enable the OpenGL target. And that's what we're going to do. And I'm also going to do against Vulkan and compile against both targets. And every time you launch an OpenGL4, it's going to tell you it's deprecated, and you shouldn't be doing that. But what we want to do first is re-enable OpenGL. So I'm going to use kwrite. And now we can go to where we downloaded the source. It makes a folder called Unreal Engine. And then we want to go inside Engine, Config, and Base Engine any. Now, a couple words of caution. So there are several places in a production environment you can actually be setting things. There's a hierarchy of these ini files. It's beyond the scope of this. We're showing you the quickest way to get up and running. This may not be the most elegant solution for your environment. So it's recommended becoming more familiar with these files if you want to continue to venture further after this tutorial. So what we need to look now is for the OpenGL target and re-enable it. Just make this window a little bit smaller. I can't quite see what I'm doing. There we go. So we found this line here, and we can actually just uncomment this. We will have it build against Vulkan and OpenGL4. So we just take out the comment line there and resave that. And that would be it if you needed to fall back on the OpenGL4 target. Now for Vulkan, in our case, we're going to want to install Vulkan tools. So we're going to close this. And for this, you're going to need, like I said, super users, sudo or permissions. We like to think of ourselves as super users in the Unix world for whatever reason we do these things, right? So we hit sudo apt-get install Vulkan-tools. And we go for the usual things, installs dependencies, done. So we should have Vulkan installed now too. So that's it for installing Vulkan on Ubuntu, which is a Debian-based system, right? Now on a Red Hat-based system like CentOS, it would be sudo yum install, I believe. And then, like I said, use a list command earlier to ensure it's either Vulkan or Vulkan API. I'm pretty sure it's just Vulkan on Red Hat. And that'll install your dependencies of the Vulkan file system as well. Let's clear the screen so we can see what we're doing. I probably should also mention that if you had just installed the Vulkan API, in some cases you may need to restart X server or your machine. So for the next two parts, what we want to look at is build the setup dependencies and generate the project, which we're going to build. Building the dependencies is a simple script they're providing. It's great. Very little legwork for us to do. We just run it and again, wait quite a bit. And some time will pass. And then after that, we're going to run another script which will generate the project. Now, don't confuse this project with the project in the Unreal Engine. This is the build project to compile the software. We downloaded everything with Git to Unreal Engine. And then we can see a couple things in here. One called setup. Now we're in shell, so we actually want setup sh. And this will set up our dependencies. And again, depending on your internet connection, this may be a good time to just pause, send out a Mother's Day card because today is Mother's Day, grab a cup of coffee, or maybe make a sandwich because you may be waiting quite a bit. Okay, so some time passed and you probably saw a whole lot related to setting up Mono and then something along the lines of downloading toolchain. And then a whole bunch of verbosity, largely related to Clang. And then these messages, which tell you if you haven't seen success, building to finish properly. And it tells you to check the log. But fortunately, we do see success. I rarely haven't seen it. And one thing to remember again is internet access isn't necessarily required to do this. You can do it by building the dependencies. However, I wouldn't recommend doing it for the sake of this tutorial, and it's really beyond the scope. Now that we've done that, we can generate the project files to build a project. So first I'm going to clear the screen. And again, thank you, Epic. We have a very nice prefabricated script that just does this for us and builds the entire project setup for us, which is great. We just run that. And then we wait a minute or so. This one shouldn't take quite as long. Okay, so hopefully after about 1 or 2 minutes, and not much more, you saw messages similar to this, 100%, 100%, 100%, and everything looks okay. Now the last step before we can actually try to launch a test this, so we need to actually compile the project. And depending on the speed of your machine and the amount of RAM, you can expect this to take anywhere from 45 minutes to 4 or 5 hours. So unlike the last few, I said maybe go make a cup of coffee. Depending on your machine, it may be more appropriate to make a small roast or knit a small sweater or do a small jigsaw puzzle. But I'll leave those exercises to you. We're still in the same directory. Now all we have to do is type make, and then we walk away from the computer. And I see everybody in a couple of hours. Hopefully you had a good nap or knitted yourself a nice sweater, and you were able to compile without errors or any significant warnings in the shell. So what we're going to do is test this and give it a go and try to give the editor a launch. I'm going to go to Engine, Binaries, Linux, and then you want to run UE4 editor. Much as we're getting used to, this is the first time we're running the editor. It's going to take quite a bit of time to load. Maybe, depending on your system, 3 to 7 or 8 minutes. So it's a good time again to go back and maybe eat some of that roast you made or put on that sweater. Okay, so hopefully at this point, if you were watching, you saw a bunch of messages go by about caching and logs, a lot of things about shader compilation, because this is the first time you're running it. And you got to the screen, which complements a mono, gives you a very Microsoft Windows kind of look. Go to Game, First Person Shooter, and I have an area for these projects, and let's call this Tutorial. And then we can hit Create Project. And one thing to note is we did launch this. I had compiled both against Vulkan and OpenGL. So by default, we did launch Vulkan. We still have OpenGL as a fallback, and for those that only have the OpenGL target, you will only launch an OpenGL. Okay, so hopefully after 2 minutes or so, you have this pop open. And if all went successfully, you are looking at the Unreal Engine editor in Linux for 4.25. Currently at the time I'm doing this tutorial. And we can see it does in fact work. Now what we want to do is exit. And we're going to try launching this again under OGL4. Okay, so first we're going to clear this window. Okay, so now we're going to try the same thing, but we're going to launch it from the command line, forcing OGL4. And again, this is going to take a couple of minutes. One of the things you'll notice, and it'll show that you correctly launch it with OpenGL if using the command line flag, or you're going to see this all the time if you're forced to use OpenGL until you can update to Vulkan, is you'll get this little X window warning saying OpenGL is deprecated. Please use Vulkan. I advise you the same, but for the purpose of this exercise, we're showing it against both targets. Now that we've established that Unreal is compiled and working, the next thing we want to do is get Houdini, download, install. We want to purchase a free Houdini Indie license, purchase in quotes, because it is free if you do qualify for it and need one. Thank you, side effects. And we're going to install Houdini source env and retrieve the licenses from the license management application. And then we're going to get a valid HTA optionally, if you need one, from Orbalt of an appropriate license, so we have something to test with inside the engine. Now, if you go to sideeffects.com/download and log in, you can download the latest production build of Houdini. And you can do this against daily builds as well, but for safety, we're going to go with the current production build. And while that's downloading, we get this nice thank you screen. And there's some interesting things, which is under install, it says, next, you should install the software on the computer. You only need to install, once again, Houdini Engine. The install will also let you install Houdini Engine plugins for Autodesk, Maya, Unity, and UE4, which would be Unreal Engine 4. This information is not entirely correct. That's only correct for Windows. And the other thing we do want to note, too, is the build number of what we just downloaded, which you can see here is build 460. And we're going to need to know that in order to edit the source files later when we go to build the plugin. As mentioned, if you need a Houdini Engine license and you meet the requirements from side effects, you can get an Engine Indie license. If you do not meet the requirements, unfortunately, you're going to have to look for a valid commercial license. Or if you do meet the requirements, we can click on the Houdini store. And you'll see Buy Houdini. And this actually isn't going to cost money if you meet the requirements. And in my case, I'm just doing a tutorial. It's just research, and that's legitimate. And you can see here, Indie. And here are the requirements. And basically, they want you to make it under 100,000 and some other reasonable things. But the engine license, which is what we need, is free. So this is great. And you can just go add to the cart, and then you can proceed through a checkout process. They won't ask for any money. You can see here the cost is 0. And then we can go retrieve your license entitlements when we go in. Install Houdini. So we want to go to where we downloaded the tar zip. And we want to unarchive it, which is just tar, expand, verbose, and the name of the download. And this will only take 1 second. It'll expand it out into a directory. And Side Effects gives us a very easy script that runs a installer with options that allows us to quickly get up and running. Okay, and I did mention earlier you will need some kind of admin privileges because we do want to install into /opt, which is the default. So sudo Houdini install. And it's going to ask you for your password. Yours shall be different than mine. And we get to your standard license agreement, which, of course, everybody diligently reads, and you should at least once. I have been reading this for a very long time, so I'm just going to hit space and go through it. And you agree, and we see here our options on the installer. We do want Houdini. I personally don't like the desktop menus. I usually work in the shell. It just clutters things for me. And I do leave it default to make the symlink and opt. And you do want to make sure you install the license server. And as you can see here, even though we did say in the instructions, it does have the engine plugin for Maya and for Unity, but there is no engine plugin for Unreal, which we'll take care of in a moment. So you hit F to finish. And would you like to start the installation? In brackets says Y, that's the default. Yes, yes, we want it in the default location. And it starts to install. And it really doesn't take so long. The installation typically is just, under a minute to a couple minutes. Okay, and I hope we enjoy using Houdini 18, and I'm sure we will. So the next thing we want to do is we want to source the Houdini environment. Now, if you're used to running Houdini from an icon, let's say in Windows, even from the Linux desktop, it does source an environment that sets certain variables that need to be known by manager in Houdini. If you're used to working in a more Linux-based production environment, you've probably been sourcing this file for a long time. So we do push D, OPT, HFS 18, and source Houdini setup. Now the Houdini environment has been initialized, and you can even see that if you do print env pipe grep who, and you can see all these nice Houdini variables. But what we want to do now is run the license administration tool, which is HK. And since we are now in the environment, we can do that. And it's connecting to the license server, which is local in our case. This is because I was already logged in, and you can actually see here I have the Indie Engine license with a year license. Thank you again, Side Effects. For you, if this is your first time launching it, you'll have to log in. By going to file login, or it may just pop up and ask you to log in, and then put in your email address and password to retrieve your license entitlements, and it just installs it automatically for you. So you're going to need an OTL, otherwise known as a Houdini Digital Asset. The whole point of the engine running on Unreal is to be able to manipulate top-level parameters of these assets from inside the engine to generate geometry for its cache. If you have a commercial license, or if you have an Indie Interactive license, you could do this yourself. Create an arbitrary fun OBJ or SOP level HCA or TL. If you do not have an interactive license, you can download one from Orbolt, the Houdini Smart Asset Store, which has a lot of OTLs, and that's what I did for the purpose of this demo as well. So we go back to the web browser. If you go to orbolt.com, And then you can browse around and try to find something of the appropriate indie or commercial license. Some of them are free, some cost a little money. For this purpose, I picked a free one. And that is Spiral Stairs. That is the one I'll be testing with. So it generates spiral stairs in Houdini. And we're going to make sure it does that via the engine inside the Unreal Editor to bake it into the cache. So take a second if you need an asset and try to find one that tickles your fancy to play with for the rest of the tests. Okay, so at this point we want to start actually dealing with the Houdini Engine plugin for Unreal Engine. And this will allow us to host the Houdini libraries and run Houdini Digital Assets inside of the Unreal Editor. As of so far, we have gotten the source of Unreal. We have compiled it, learning about how to deal with Vulkan or OpenGL. We have launched it and made a project and shown that it works correctly. We have installed and licensed Houdini with an indie license if that is what you need. And we are in a shell where we have previously sourced the environment. Now, if you close that shell, that's fine. Just cd opt hfs 18 like we did before with your build number and source Houdini setup. And we're going to go back to that shell in one moment. We want to go to the GitHub page for side effects, specifically for the Houdini engine for Unreal, which is github/side effects sidefects/Houdini engine. You might be confused, but you are in the right place. This is the people we know and love that make Houdini. And we can see a couple of things. There's some instructions down below that note how to install from source. And specifically that the build number may be wrong because it's whatever build number that it was tested when the code was committed. It could have been a daily build, but it's very unlikely, and as in it's never been for me, the current production build we're working with. The current production build may be a couple builds newer. I wouldn't recommend going with one older. And actually, if you look, you can see here where they bumped the version, and you can actually see the diff. And if you did want to keep house properly, in addition to the places you have to do it, which is in the 2CS files, there's also the plugin manifest and a couple places in the comment and in the happy file as well. What we do need, as before, is the Git address, which here. And again, if you're not comfortable with Git or SVN, feel free just to download the zip. I am going to get the Git address. And now we're going to go back to our shell. And we want to go, remember, we want the Houdini environment sourced. And we want to go back to our directory where we're running the Unreal binaries. Actually, a little higher up than that, but where are we working with Unreal? Then we go in the source. And now we want to go into Engine, Plugins, Runtime. It's going to look for a folder with a very specific name, and we need to make that folder, which is Houdini with a big H, no space, engine. Now when we git clone, we want to git clone specifically into this directory. Last time when we just said git clone in the address, it creates a folder with the default project name, which in this case would be the Houdini Engine for Unreal. So we do have to make sure we target this folder with a specific name. Do git clone, the address we copied from before, and we want to clone it to the Houdini Engine folder we just created. And remember how we noted the build number earlier? That was because we need to edit a couple files. Because if we try to compile this right now, this isn't the same build number it was used when it was committed. So we noted build 460, and if we go back and look at this web page, we can actually see everywhere it's 458. So it's going to look for all the wrong things. Clear the screen real quick. Okay. Now from here we want to go to actually where the Houdini Engine plugin, so Houdini Engine. And then source. Then Houdini Engine Editor. And we want to edit this file. I use now, it's just a quick shell editor. The Houdini Engine Editor.build.cs. If we look inside here, there's actually two places. If you wanted to do proper housekeeping, you could do it here as well. It's not necessary. But we're here, so might as well. Mark that as 460, which is our build number. You'll see the string down here, Houdini version. That also needs to be 460. Okay. And to get out of this, we Control X, Y to save. Absolutely. And then we want to go now to Houdini Engine up one level into Houdini Engine runtime. And there's a similarly named file there. And go figure again. We use nano. And for good housekeeping, so we do want it to match in both places. But this, again, this is the important. The top one is just in the comments. You don't necessarily need to do that. All right. And now those two are edited. So now we want to go back up a couple levels. Or a lot of levels. More. Until we're back in the main folder, which in my case is just Unreal Engine. And before we had run those generate project scripts, well, now we need to generate a new project because we have the plugins, and those weren't included in the previous project. And for very obvious reasons, we do want to use those. So just as before, we want to run the generate files shell script. And with any luck, you'll see this down here. And you can see, because we did source the environment in the shell before we had run this, that I was able to use those variables and find the information it needed. And it shows us build 460, which now matches what's in the build script. So hopefully we won't see any errors, and this will only take a moment. And then we're going to remake the project. But when we remake it, it should just make the missing plugins that we had it made before. And it should be able to reuse everything that was there. Okay, so if all went well with the compile, you didn't see any errors. You may have seen some warnings go by about deprecations. We're not going to worry about that right now. That's more of the maintainer of the plugin to worry about, because that's beyond the scope of this tutorial. What we want to do is now test this in a clean shell. So let's open a new shell tab. And just as before, we got to make sure we source the Houdini environment. So we want to push D, OPT, HFS 18 460, source Houdini setup. And our environment has been initialized. We want to pop D, go back to where we were. We're back in the Unreal Engine directory. And now, just as before, we want to go and launch it from the binaries folder, which is cd engine binaries Linux /UE4 editor. And that's going to take a minute or two to launch. Not quite as long as before, but it will take a minute or two. While this is launching, what we want to do now really is test that everything is working together. Make sure that everything we did is coming together into play and that it's all working correctly. First thing is to make sure our Unreal launches without any significant warnings or errors, which is what we're confirming right now. Then we want to make sure the Houdini Engine plugin is shown and that it's enabled inside of the Unreal editor. We want to confirm that the additional menu items and functionality has been added to the editor. And then we want to confirm that an HDA loads is accessible inside of the engine. So we have our little project selector screen, and we have this tutorial one I had made earlier from when we first tested. So we're just going to open that. And we're going to give that a minute or two to load. Okay, so hopefully Unreal Editor popped open and it didn't have any significant warnings or errors. And you have your shooter scene we had made earlier open. And the first thing we want to do is confirm that the plugin is indeed available to Unreal Engine. So we go Edit, Plugins. And right away it puts on the top, there's a new plugin, and it's Houdini Engine, and it's already enabled for us, which is great. So we can just close that. The next thing we want to do is confirm that the menu items are there. And under the File menu, it should have made a section here called Houdini Engine with an assortment of abilities. And the last thing we want to do, which to prove that everything came together, is to open the OTL we had downloaded from Orbolt Store earlier. which in my case is spiral staircase. And you'll notice that it'll be, unless you put it somewhere else, it should be in your home directory under Houdini18 Asset Store, your username on Orbolt, and then OTLs. And we just hit open. And you can see right away it appears inside of Unreal. So we have it available to us in the editor as asset under content. Now we want to instantiate it inside of the viewport. We just drag it up there. And it'll give you by default is this little Houdini logo thing until it bakes. And look at that. That is the staircase. And if we go over here to our right under details, you can see actually it warns us here we're in limited commercial mode, which is fine. We're just testing. And this gives you all the parameters that were available at the top level of OTL. So let's adjust some, I guess. Why not? The number of stairs right now is on 4, so let's make that 6. Let's say we want to bring the height up to... And there you have it. All right, so if you're able to follow along for the entirety of this video, you should now have Unreal Engine 4.25 in Linux with Vulkan or OGL4, because you now know how to fall back on that, and able to load a Houdini HDA inside of Houdini Engine for Unreal after we have compiled the plugin. Whew, that's a bit of work. Congratulations if you made it this far, and thank you for watching. I would also like to thank Side Effects for making the Indian non-commercial licenses available for the many non-commercial independent uses we get to have them for. That's really a great value. And I'd like to thank Epic for opening up the source code for Unreal. So we're able to go and compile these things and see them for ourselves on Linux. Thanks again, and feel free to stop by my website, ivex.com.